I'm glad you bring that up. I'm glad you bring that up. So Reuters produced Donald Trump's peace plan. And I got to be honest with you, I'm somewhat confused. Not entirely, but I want to get your take.
Did you play the music clip that goes along with it?
I did not play the music clip.
I've seen that there is a music clip that goes with it. It goes dun 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 dun. You know, the circus theme, right? Because that's what this peace plan is.
And by the way, he said it's his
I
final
consider
offer.
it actually not just a joke, but an offense. It is insulting that Trump is presenting this.
It's the point of this plan to be denied because I couldn't. There are so many red lines in this plan, and Donald Trump is like, I present it as my final plan. But Putin is being very magnanimous. Peskov is being very, again, magnanimous. Well, we appreciate the acknowledgement of the Crimea that Donald Trump acknowledges this is Russian territory. We appreciate that. We accept that Donald Trump says that they voted to leave, and damn it, they left. Fair enough. However, there are other things that we need to discuss and other things we need to talk about. We're not going to litigate this in public. This is going to be realpolitik. Like they're being very, diplomatic about something that they know is a dead letter on its face. The stuff that is in this is pretty astonishing, which is why I wanted to get your take on why they were being so magnanimous about it. And maybe the whole point is, right, we're going to be political because, you got to be that way if you want to, come on, add it to the stage. There we are. So just a few points. Permanent ceasefire, again, dead letter. Both sides immediately engage in technical implementation of negotiations.
So first of all, Russia has no interest in a ceasefire.
Exactly.
Right? That allows the West to send more weapons to Ukraine, to the Kiev regime, to give them a breather and a chance to conscript and at least give a minimal amount of training to new forced conscripts. Russia has no interest in that. They're winning on the battlefield. They do not benefit from a ceasefire. The Kiev regime does. Therefore, they will not accept a ceasefire without the conditions they have already Putin laid out well back in the 14th of June of last year, which include the Kiev regime vacating all of the remaining territory that they hold in the three regions really, in question, which of course they're not going to do. Right. But also the Russian government has since also demanded that the West, not just the United States, but the West, stop all military and intelligence aid to the Kiev regime. And until then, there will be no ceasefire. We don't care.
Makes sense, right? Because at that point, you're just loading them up with weapons. Wow,
this is the Minsk 1, Minsk 2, Istanbul communique, no more unilateral ceasefires.
That goes to the other part. Yeah. U.S. provides de jure recognition of the territories that Russia has effectively liberated.
Hey, what does that mean? What does that mean? That doesn't mean
that means a ceasefire. I mean, that means a frozen conflict. That's what that means. Yeah. Because it means
for how long, right? For 1 year, for 1 month, for 1 year, for 2 years till Trump leaves office. That de jure recognition means, de jure recognition, even de jure recognition of Crimea. That could be changed with the next U.S. president, right? It could be changed with this president, right? Because when we're talking de facto recognition, then that means absolutely nothing. That means less than nothing, as far as I'm concerned. And we have had an intelligence report from the Russian intelligence agencies on the conflict in Ukraine that has been recently delivered to Putin's office. We haven't seen the entire report, quite obviously, but we've had some leaked tidbits from it. And basically, what they're saying is that, the Americans can't offer nothing, that negotiations with the Americans will ultimately be worth less than the paper that they are written on, right? So take that into account. The Russians are playing a game, like everyone is, of manipulating Trump so that when the negotiations inevitably fail, as they will, everyone is maneuvering so that the other parties, right, meaning Europe and the Kiev regime on one side and Russia on the other, is maneuvering so that the other side receives the lion's share of the blame from Trump's ego personally for the failure of his great, peace plan. And Russia's playing that game, right?
But
They're
Trump has to
certainly not.
know that this was a dead letter. I
No,
mean, the
he doesn't.
idea that the
He
Trump
doesn't
administration,
have to know that. He does
but the
not have to
notion
know that.
that the U.S. is going to take Zaporozhye nuclear power plant and run it.
It's a great deal. Everyone gets energy, right? It's a great deal. Why wouldn't you take that? I'm a good guy. I'll take good care of that nuclear power plant. Right? I mean, no, we do not know it. We've got Mike Waltz and Marco Rubio and these other neocons, Kellogg, whom is obviously out there in La La Land, advising Trump, right? On one hand, and Witkoff and others that seem to be at least more amenable to the reality, which is the Russian position. But that we cannot make the assumption that Trump knows the real situation. I would posit that he doesn't. This offer means that he does not know the real situation.
Wow. Or that he does.
5D chess, that this is some maneuver and he knows it's going to fail and he's trying to create political space to blame the Kiev regime. I think he's already got that. I think if he wanted to do that, he could have done that at the White House moment. I'm not a big fan of the Trump 5D chess theorems, and there are a zillion of them out there. I don't see any 5D chess plans coming from the Trump administration on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, on Iran, on trade war, tariff war with China. I see a whole lot of clusterfucks. That's what I see.
It is what it is. What it is. It's not. There's a playbook at work.
Take a look at the signal chats that use the bombing emoticons for bombing Yemen, right? That Hegseth and others, put out there. This is not a team of crack 5D chess thinking geostrategic geniuses running this administration. This is a New York real estate developer and self-branding magnate and his collection of political personal loyalists.
So from the Russian point of view, this deal is going to fail. We are going to be very magnanimous and diplomatic as we talk about this deal and everything else, but we know as a flat fact.
And we're going to try to make sure the blame falls on the Kiev regime in Ukraine and the Europeans.
So we can get some kind of deal with America, like basically bring down the temperature with the Americans because we're going to blame them for.
Yeah, well, again, Russia does still want to improve bilateral relations. But more importantly, when the deal breaks down, they don't want Trump to revert back to the Biden policy of continuing to provide weapons and intelligence to Ukraine for the foreseeable future if there's no peace settlement, and possibly escalating things further. And Trump, once again, not that Russia places a lot of seriousness on threats of banking sanctions or secondary sanctions, but Trump has returned once again in his foreign policy by Truth Social posts with all screaming capital letters of demanding that Vladimir stop and threatening sanctions if Putin is leading him on about wanting peace. Russia does want peace on their terms, not your terms. You lost this conflict. You admitted, Rubio admitted, this was the U.S.'s proxy war on Russia in Ukraine. It said it flat out, right? And you can argue, this is Biden's war, not mine. It's your war. When you became president, Russians have since died from American weapons. This is your war. You own it, right? If you want to try and, as part of your face-saving spin, want to blame it, the war on Biden and everything, Russia will probably grant you that as long as you walk away, right? And let Russia finish what they're going to do in Ukraine, right? And it has to be said that during that briefing, Putin was speaking about removing the Nazi regime in Kiev, in Ukraine, right? That is significant. That is the first. We've heard it from Lavrov. We've heard it from, Peskov. We've heard it from others. But this is the first time we have heard Putin specifically, essentially, first of all, characterize the regime in Kiev as Nazi. All right, I prefer the term more exact, Banderite, right? The specific type of fascism that was generated in Western Ukraine in the 1930s. But regardless, he also, made clear allusions to, our goals of removing that regime.
Yeah.
Right. Now, a regime removal can happen politically instead of militarily. I think it's unlikely, but the goal is, as far as the Russian government is concerned, regime change now. And I think we've been saying that for a long time.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, denazification. How do you do it?
Putin himself has said it.
So that is now one of the key objectives, which means either they're going to Kiev or, I guess, create a political crisis one way or the other.
Yeah, I honestly
don't.
don't know how the regime can be removed without. I mean, the regime doesn't mean Zelensky. The regime means the regime.
Exactly.
The Maidan regime that came to power, with the openly West-backed putsch in 2014, right? And, I mean, Poroshenko was replaced with Zelensky and the regime survived, right? So removing Zelensky does not mean the regime is gone. The regime must be removed, right? And I just, maybe some avenue to remove it politically, at some point in the future will be, come into vision, but I don't see how that can be done without some type of military victory and forcing an unconditional surrender.
But as you pointed out, the Sumy going through that area is the road to Kiev. In many
road
respects.
to Kiev. Yeah.
Wow.
And unfortunately, in that case, the road to Kiev may just lead to the road to Lvov. But
okay, fair enough. Okay. So this deal is dead. Donald Trump is going to flip out at some point. Oh my God, I can't believe you guys are horrible people. You're not accepting my deal. The blame is going to land somewhere, whether it's on Europe and Zelensky, or for that matter, whether it's on.
You've seen those casino spinning wheels, right? I don't know what the exact name, the roulette wheel or whatever, and you're trying to decide whether the ball's going to bounce on the black or red. That's what it is. Who ends up with the blame when these peace settlements in the next week or 2 weeks or whatever fail? Because they will fail. And we've been talking about it since September. Russia is going to effectively say no, right? Zelensky may also open his mouth and say no if he's stupid, right?
He's been saying no the whole time, by the way.
Yeah, well, the Europeans have been trying to rein him in and keep him quiet and say, do the smart thing and say, let Russia say no. You just keep your mouth shut and agree with whatever he says, because it's never going to happen anyway. At the end of the day, Russia is going to say no. But Zelensky has his own little mental political games. He's got his own Banderites to deal with in his own regime and so forth. And he's stupid enough to put himself out there. I mean, a smart, strategic thinking, diplomatic thinking person would say the Russians are never going to agree to this anyway. So I can tactically agree to it with the certain knowledge that it will never be put into force and it will line me on Trump's good side. But he keeps not doing that.
But this also means, though, that Russia, has to take all of Ukraine? And I mean, where do they stop, or can they stop at this point?
I can't tell you that. I can't tell you that. I don't know how long the Europeans can keep the regime fighting. I don't know if Trump is going to resume military aid. There have been assessments by the Russian intelligence report that I mentioned earlier, supposedly also says that their assessment was that the regime could continue to fight without U.S. support for another 12 to 20 months. or
Are you
12 to 30.
serious?
Yes. But in this report, they also then said that that may now be an overestimate, right? But we don't know, right? I am continually amazed that the Kiev regime is able to keep its military fighting. I'm always impressed after everything that has happened, after a continuous stream of Russian victories since defeating the summer offensive in 2023. And but it is a slow grinding improvement, and it was interrupted by this great narrative winning humiliating Kursk incursion, right? I seriously listened to Western experts, right? We listened. It was no less than Michael Kaufman at CNAS, right? And he was on War on the Rocks, and he certainly said it was a big victory for the narrative. And I'm like, maybe that's your problem, is you've been fighting a narrative war instead of the real war for the last 3 years. I hope that narrative victory was your narrative Stalingrad, because it hasn't netted you anything now.
I guess what I'm getting at is this is no longer a special military operation. This is a war. And in real terms, they have to take all of Ukraine. Like, meaning whether Trump continues the weapons, whether Europe continues the money and the weapons, regardless of anything else, there is no stopping point where
That
they
is
can say,
that is the likely, right? There are other, right? Let's say that the Europeans and the Americans both agree to a deal that would remove the regime. That's extremely unlikely, right? That it could be achieved politically. It could be achieved with some type of political collapse, right? Where the ultra nationalists or I can't really see. I don't think Poroshenko has the political power to stage some type of internal coup that would lead to the collapse. But the ultra nationalists may at some time, the Banderites, the actual Banderite military leaders, they may at some point, turn. And that again, I think it's unlikely because they know where their survival depends. But there's a possibility at some point down the road that there could be some type of internal political collapse. And there is the possibility of some type of unconditional surrender being forced and actually accepted, right? But I just can't see them at the moment. I think that the chances of them being, of it ending that way are still, not nothing, but still slim, right? They obviously, any of those would be preferable than fighting all the way past Kiev to Lvov and the border with Poland. But Russia has to be prepared that it may be that, and even after that, then you'll almost certainly be looking at a guerrilla war staged out of Europe, where the Europeans will only recognize their band of Banderites and whoever as the legitimate government of Ukraine and everything. There is no end to this. I said it back in February, or actually early March, in an interview, my first interview on the conflict on Consortium News. And I said this would be a forever war. There were other people on that same thing that were saying this is all going to be over in 2 months. It's all going to be over in 2 months, right? And I said it would be a forever war in one form or another, frozen conflict, guerrilla war, whatever, but that Ukraine was broken, right? Humpty Dumpty fell off the wall, and all the hegemon's forces and all the hegemon's men couldn't put Ukraine back together again.
Is that what you're looking for? Like, meaning is that because either Europe is delusional, or in their minds, force them to take it all and force the guerrilla war. Meaning they're seeing the same thing you're seeing.
Did you keep hearing the European leaders saying they're going to be at war with Russia in 5 years or so? That's what they're talking about. They think that they can drag this out for a number of years. There may be a fortuitous change in a U.S. presidency within that period of time. They're going to ride this out and hope that there's some black swan event or some change of circumstances that will change the end game calculus. But the Europeans have no more intentions of any type of peaceful conclusion of this, except on their own terms, meaning a complete Ukrainian victory and Russia's unconditional surrender, any more than Russia does, the opposite. So that's unfortunately, I do not see, certainly, I mean, we could see at some point ceasefires declared, right? We could see some type of frozen conflict temporarily come into existence for a number of months, a year, even, those are all possibilities down the road. Yeah. But this ends with the end of Ukraine as we know it, right? That I consider an inevitability in the long term.
Mark, wow. Fantastic analysis. That is depressing as all hell.
Yeah, and those aren't good things for Russia, right? Think of the reconstruction costs of the entirety of Ukraine, because no Russian politician has an answer to that, right? No, much less a continued cold/hot war with Europe going on for years into the future, maybe with the US, maybe not. These are not good Russian outcomes. These are not the outcome that Putin wanted when he launched the special military operation in 2022. But I would argue that it was probably the most likely outcome, whether it was what Russia wanted or not. There is no good outcome. John Mearsheimer said it best. I will continue to use it. He said Russia will win, but it will be an ugly victory. Yeah, I mean they're never. We don't live in the world of platonic ideals, right? Everything is ugly in this world, right? Including whatever Russian victory comes out of this. It will be a Russian victory, but it won't be a clean, perfect victory with normalization of relations and some type of pro-Russian Ukrainian government power coming into power in Kiev that the West accepts and Russia accepts. No, it's just not in the cards.
The alternative of Ukraine being part of NATO is worse, right? I mean,
no. I don't agree with that. I do not agree with that.
That's a question. That's not.
Yeah. No, I don't agree with that, because a weaponized Ukraine whose entire military, economy, and population was directed to be a weapon against Russia, which is the NATO alternative. Whether NATO or de facto NATO, as far as Russia is concerned, there's really no difference there. That was what was going to happen after 2014 and after the failure of the naive and ill-fated Minsk agreements, at least as far as I'm concerned, right? That was why Russia had to act. Ukraine was going to literally, its population, its economy, its military, everything, its intelligence was going to be weaponized as a battle platform pointed at Moscow. And Russia could not allow that to continue. Much less come into full being. Right. It had to remove. That's why when Russia says it was an existential threat, that's not rhetoric. That is very real, right? I mean, we've all read the reports. The New York Times reported openly. The CIA rebuilt Ukrainian intelligence and military intelligence from the ground up and opened 12 bases on the Russian border that they were launching covert operations into Russia.
That's what I'm saying. That's worse. That's a worst case scenario than the special military operation that effectively was taking place. Yeah. Like, you couldn't allow Ukraine to become that platform.
It would have been much better if Putin had acted in 2014, right? Or in 2015, or the Minsk Accords. Maybe Russia was not prepared at that time, but neither was the Kiev regime or the West, right? And since then, it has always been inevitable. Either it was an existential question. Eventually, Ukraine would be weaponized against Russia into some either political or military full extent, and that's why the West provoked it. Right? They are the ones who oversaw the overthrow of the fairly neutral, a Ukrainian government committed to geopolitical neutrality. And when they said no to the EU association agreement, and then the full weaponization of Ukraine then commenced, and Russia just could not allow it. It's a bad outcome, right? The special military operation is a worst possibility outcome. I mean, other than outright World War III, right? I mean, that no one should have any illusion here. It should never have had to come to this, but it had to be done because the alternative of a NATO battle platform made out of Ukraine is even worse.
Yeah,
for Russia.
Mark, great breakdown. It is unfortunate that this is going to continue on, linger on, but
it's our lives. Just get used to it.
Mark Sleboda, International Relations Security Analyst. Mark, where can people find you?
At Elon Musk's Twitter X at Mark Sleboda 1, or at Substack or Telegram at The Real Politique with Mark Sleboda.
His analysis is fantastic. Mark, you have been one of the best ones, man. Thank you for this. You have a good one. Be safe, okay?
Cheers. Thanks.
All right. Bye-bye. Mark is fantastic.